100 years ago, in May 1883, a dormant volcano on a remote island in the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra began a series of violent eruptions. It belched out vast clouds of ash that obscured the sun. The explosions were heard 70 miles away. Towards the end of May, the fireworks seemed to have died down a little, though ships passing through the straits at night could see the glow of molten lava in the crater. Large-scale eruptions began again in mid-June. This time they were even more violent. Earth tremors were felt in many parts of Java and Sumatra. The crater where the explosions had begun had been blown away, but now there were at least 10 others belching out steam and pumice dust so high that the ash fell on villages 300 miles away. The climax came on August the 27th, 1883, with an explosion equal to 3,000 atom bombs. Half the island of Krakatoa disappeared with a bang that was heard as far away as Sri Lanka and Australia. It was the loudest noise the world has ever known. Amazingly, the actual explosion killed very few people. The havoc was caused by the seismic waves called tsunamis that followed. Some were 100 feet high. The tsunamis ripped over low-lying areas, wiping out mainland towns and villages, including the little port of Anya, shown here as a mere collection of huts. It is estimated that 36,000 people died. Contemporary engravings show ships sailing through seas of corpses. This amazing series of photographs, taken a few days later on the mainland, shows scenes reminiscent of Hiroshima. All that remained of a railway and a railway engine. The giant waves flattened everything, including a hotel and a fort. A Dutch gunboat was struck by a series of 90-foot waves and carried over a mile into the jungle. After the Big Bang, there was one minor explosion and then silence. The dust that rose 50 miles high circled the Earth, causing spectacular sunsets for years afterwards. Half the island of Krakatoa had disappeared, much of it into the upper atmosphere. For 100 miles around, the flood waters wiped the slate clean so that nature had a fresh start. A century after the flood waters drained away is an ideal time to see what sort of job nature has made of repairing the damage. The floods flattened huge areas of jungle and destroyed countless villages. As to the wildlife there, only that lucky enough to be isolated on high ground survived. Today, Java is the most populated island in the world. At its northwest tip is an area of jungle where no one now lives. Ujung Kulon, 25 miles from Krakatoa. The reason no one lives there is that Krakatoa's tidal waves wiped everyone out. The area has never been recolonized. Today, Ujung Kulon is a national park, one of the last homes of the Javan rhino, perhaps the rarest large animal on Earth. In 100 years, the jungle has returned so completely that the only way to penetrate the park is along one of its few rivers. This one is called the Chigenta. To travel along the Chigenta's narrow 5-mile course is like making a voyage back to prehistoric times. When the great tsunamis came bursting over Ujung Kulon in August 1883, some Javan rhinos must mercifully have been caught above flood level. That a few of their descendants are living there today is due to the human side of the tragedy, the fact that Ujung Kulon has never been resettled since the disaster. The jungle is so lush that Ujung Kulon might never have been inundated by waves of salt water 50 feet high. The secret of its complete rehabilitation lies largely in its immense rainfall, over 100 inches a year. The rains are followed by 6 months of sunshine. In such a climate, almost anything will grow. When the rains end in April, it's an immediate signal for Ujung Kulon's birds to begin nesting. These are blue-throated bee-eaters. The olive-backed sunbird feeds its young in its complicated hanging nest. A female Philippine glossy starling looks for a nest hole. A pair of brown-capped woodpeckers has already found one, though they're still hollowing it out. A well-grown young red-headed flower pecker waits to be fed. An ashy wood swallow feeds its young after they've left the nest. The yellow-bellied prinia arrives to supply its young and removes a dropping from the nest. That's a grey-cheeked bulbul going about its family duties. The open banks of the little river offer insect-eating birds an abundance of food. The mudflats of the Chigenta River are home to thousands of fiddler crabs and a hunting ground for those who find crab a delicacy. The crabs are not fiddling away in the hope of scaring off the river monitor. The waving of the one big claw, which gives the fiddler its name, is territorial. The aim is to intimidate rivals. The monitor is not the least bit intimidated. Lowering its front ramp, a box terrapin prepares to go hunting. Just as there are left and right-handed boxers, so there are southpaw crabs, as well as those who lead normally with their left. The other claw is minute by comparison and used largely for feeding. Here are two left-handers locked in battle. Here the contest is between a right and a left-hander. The tidal reaches are also the home of the mud skipper, a little fish that hasn't quite made up its mind whether to live on land or in water. Every few minutes, it must dip itself in water to breathe dissolved oxygen. The raised dorsal fin is a threat to rivals. The sudden appearance of the monitor reveals that mud skippers skip equally well on water. The grey mud along the banks still contains a good deal of ash from Krakatoa's explosion. Broken down volcanic soils have encouraged plant and animal life that looks as if it might have existed in the age of the dinosaurs. The crocodiles of the Chigenta River have a special quality of menace. This monster is about to dispute territory with a rival. It's an estuarine crocodile, the fiercest and most aggressive of its kind. It's hard to imagine now that 100 years ago, Any vegetation that survived here was buried under inches and often feet of grey volcanic dust. The sombre green of the regrown jungle is a perfect setting for a Javan kingfisher's jewelled wings. But there's one fish in the Chigenta River that has learned to outwit the kingfisher in an amazing way. This little fish, a relative of the gobies, swims upside down and maneuvers a leaf with its ventral fins as a portable hide. So long as it stays below the leaf, the kingfisher can't spot it. Sometimes it makes the leaf move against the current. So far, the river's many species of fish-eating birds haven't been smart enough to work this out. Before this was filmed, the leaf-hiding behavior wasn't known to science. It's possibly one of the first cases on record of a tool-using fish. Of course, the ruse isn't so successful against predatory fish like this spotted puffer. To discourage the puffer, the fish puffs up its gills to make itself look bigger. It's a trick the puffer should understand very well. That's exactly how it defends itself against its enemies. The air is abuzz with insects and the river busy with those who feed on them, an unusual pastime for a heron. There are hungry mouths waiting for those insects which fall into the water. Very strange mouths, some of them. The needlefish's mouth is more of a flap on top of a snipe-like bill. Though these may look like a swarm of insects, what these fish are feeding on is really a cloud of crab larvae. This is an insect, an outsized one too. It's the caterpillar of the atlas moth, the largest of the silk moth family. The 4-inch-long pupa of an atlas moth hangs over the river. The giant moth maturing inside will wait for night before it emerges after its 4-month period of changing from the caterpillar. Against the moon, the snake's head pattern on the wingtip shows up to great effect. It's said to be a device to ward off predators. When the sun comes up, the crab larvae who escaped the fish shoals emerge on the sand at the river mouth. The atlas moth that hatched in the night is still drying its wings. At dawn, banteng, the last descendants of the Javan wild ox, come to graze on the one open meadow at the river's mouth. Some of their ancestors, too, were spared by Krakatoa's flood. A wild pig strolls behind a banteng cow. The bulls are darker in colour. At dawn, too, the fruit bats return to roost after a night spent raiding the wild fig trees in the jungle. They're 3 feet across the wings. Their sharp, foxy faces and red heads give them their nickname, the flying fox. That's a female coming into land with young at her breast. Motherhood doesn't seem to give her priority in landing rights. She has to force a rival off the branch. Life along the river wakes up. Insects are early risers. The river, as we've already seen, is a dangerous place for insects. Here you can literally be shot down even if you're a caterpillar hanging from a thread 10 feet above the surface. The archer fish is a tool user that shoots drops of water at its victims using a groove in the upper part of its mouth as a gun barrel. Pressure from the gills propels the water drops like bullets. Sometimes it attacks more directly. Big insects occasionally require a bombardment. Others exploit the archer's skill. The bigger fish is hoping to retrieve an insect before the archer fish can reach it. These are some of the wonders of Ujung Kulon, the national park which Krakatoa accidentally first created and then preserved. Ujung Kulon, equally accidentally, repays the debt. These Nipa fruit seeds will find their way to the mouth of the Chigenta River. In 1928, a new Krakatoa suddenly erupted from the sea, right in the center of the submarine crater left by the great explosion of 1883. Anak Krakatoa, the son of Krakatoa, is now over 1,000 feet high and showing every sign of following its parents' fiery example. This entire island has been created in just over 60 years. Anak Krakatoa still has a long way to go before it fills the gap left by its famous father. Anak Krakatoa is in the center. The sea area between the other 2 islands was land that disappeared in the Big Bang. Before the great eruption, Krakatoa was over 7 miles long. The eruption began in the crater Perbawitan. This is all that remained. The island, top left, increased in size due to deposits of volcanic ash. Anak Krakatoa has risen approximately where the 1883 eruption began. In the foreground is Rakata, the largest remaining piece of the old Krakatoa. The eruptions almost certainly killed all life there, so the forests are the result of 100 years' growth. How is life doing on the new Krakatoa? This barren landscape is by no means the whole story. Volcanoes that emerge from the ocean are perfect laboratories in which to study how life takes a grip in apparently sterile conditions. At first come the seeds born on the wind. Their mission is to find soil in what is apparently a slag heap in which they have at least some chance of germination. For the first few years, the volcanic debris is practically sterile, and then wind, rain and sun begin to break it down into fertile soil. The seeds that took root here are quite likely to have been a wind-borne gift from Ujung Kulon, just across the strait. The first scientist who visited Krakatoa 1 year after the explosion in 1884 found only one living thing, a spider. Spiders too travel on the wind by trailing gossamer threads. This is one of several species that have already colonized Anak Krakatoa. The second route by which colonists reach newly created islands is the sea. Once again, Ujung Kulon is the nearest and most likely mainland from which these visitors set sail. The seed pod, which we saw earlier leaving the mouth of the Chigenta River in Ujung Kulon, may well have made landfall on the black volcanic sand of Anak Krakatoa's beach. The currents, as well as wind, favor such colonization for 6 months of the year. These pandanus seeds have begun sprouting just above the tide line, a risky tactic that sometimes pays off, as this fully grown pandanus tree at the sea's edge demonstrates. Snakes are excellent swimmers, though it's probable that the python made the voyage on a drifting tree trunk. Ghost crabs, no problem about their arrival on Anak Krakatoa. The larvae drift in the ocean's plankton swarms. The water monitor is at home on land or sea. With plentiful supplies of ghost crabs, it has plenty to eat on arrival. Life on Anak Krakatoa is largely confined to the eastern tip. This is the only place where, in 60 years, vegetation has really established itself. But then it's had an uphill fight. The volcano has been in intermittent eruption ever since its rebirth. Molten lava and pumice ash continually bar further progress. Nevertheless, inside this miniature forest, there's a surprisingly varied flora, including Barringtonias, pandanus and mature casuarina trees. On the forest floor grows a quite rich variety of mosses, grasses, ferns, and some flowering plants like this convolvulus. Rakata, part of the original Krakatoa, is a far lusher island. But then it's had twice the time for colonization and regrowth. And this hasn't been affected by constant eruptions. Nevertheless, it is a pretty good model of what Anak Krakatoa may become, given time. The steep face down which the sea eagle is soaring is where the great volcano collapsed into its own seabed crater. Even here, large trees have taken root. Rakata Island fascinates scientists because it shows what nature can do from a standing start in 100 years. A scientist who visited Rakata in 1920, 37 years after the Great Eruption, recorded 573 species of animals, from sea eagles to beetles to fruit bats. These giant fig trees give some idea of what the forests of Anak Krakatoa could become in another 60 years. Rakata's varied 100-year fauna includes tokay geckos, flying snakes, They aren't true flyers, they glide on extended membranes. And there are land crabs for the monitor lizards to feed on. This well-fed python is probably feeding on rats. They found their way to Krakatoa some years ago. Ants were one of the first insects to move in on Krakatoa after the big eruption. During the first phase of recolonization by grasses, they were exceedingly numerous and mostly open savanna species. With the rapid development of tropical forest, the numbers dropped and woodland species, like these leaf ants, predominated. The workers here are sticking the leaves together to form a nest. Here they're using the secretions from one of their larvae as if it were a tube of glue. In 100 years, life has returned to Krakatoa in sufficient variety for different species to form complicated and useful relationships. These tree termite nests are a case in point. As it'll emerge, this hole wasn't made by termites, but by a far more glamorous creature. No one could call termites glamorous. They are, however, members of a marvelously organized community. These workers are exuding cement which they combine with their saliva to build up a nest as hard as concrete. The small transparent insects are the young, which came out from the egg fully formed. Termites dispense with the larval form. All these workers are sterile females. So are the heavily armed soldiers. The sole purpose of every member is simply to service their 4-inch-long queen hidden deep in the egg-laying chamber. Termites are used to sharing their nests with other creatures. Ground-nesting termites often play hosts to mongooses and snakes. With tree termites, the guest is not infrequently a bird. Many kingfishers tunnel into banks to make their nests. On Krakatoa, the crumbly volcanic soil is often unsuitable for tunneling. The hard-packed cement of a tree termite nest makes an excellent alternative. The collared kingfisher's young are nearly ready to fly. She's feeding them on ghost crabs. The interesting thing about the kingfisher's family is that though the visiting parent seems to have no control over which of her children begs at the nest hole, all seem to get fair shares. No one chick has grown at the expense of the others, so there must be some system of rotation, perhaps based on the time it takes to digest the last meal. Sometimes the parents bring a golden skink, and whoever gets that to swallow isn't going to be ready for another meal for quite some time. Note that the skink lost its tail in the attempt to avoid capture. The captor seems to be wondering whether to swallow the tail or deliver it to the young in the nest. Even while these scenes were being filmed, Anak Krakatoa, 2 miles away, was once again flexing its muscles. At the end of 3 weeks, the young collared kingfishers are ready to leave the nest. Parental duties aren't over yet. A young bird perches on a lump of Krakatoa's larva, while the parent bird brings it yet another ghost crab. As for the termites, they have the nest all to themselves once more. Now it's possible to see how both sides have benefited from the association. Moving debris shows how the termites have steadily been feeding on and clearing up the droppings and scraps of food left by the young birds. While termites clear up below, ants forage on the surface. Almost as if getting ready for the centenary celebrations, Anak Krakatoa was particularly active during the early 1980s. It was a busy time for several of Indonesia's 1,000-odd volcanoes. In 1982, the dust from 2 other eruptions almost fatally stopped the engines of 2 Boeing 747s at over 20,000 feet. Krakatoa wasn't responsible that time. All the same, you can't help feeling that it's working up to something big. Perhaps the most eerie place from which to observe these pyrotechnics is the sea-filled center of what was once Krakatoa Island. The rocks in the foreground stand up like a jagged tooth from the broken jaw of Krakatoa's old crater. Below is the empty magma chamber into which the sea rushed to become superheated steam and into which most of Krakatoa eventually collapsed, causing the big final explosion. The reefs off Krakatoa are especially rich. Once again, the fascinating thing for scientists is that they can be dated precisely. If there is one thing that coral polyps detest, it is being buried in silt. Those reefs that weren't utterly destroyed by the 1883 eruption were buried under up to 30 meters of ash. Today, Krakatoa's reefs are as rich in marine life as anywhere in the tropics. The birth date of their corals is known almost to the hour. The Indonesian authorities are keen to extend the boundaries of the Ujung Kulon National Park to include the marine habitats around Krakatoa and its attendant islands. The richness of sea life, both below and above the surface, makes this urgently necessary. The tuna chase the little fish to the surface, and the frigate birds home in on the small fry in a feeding frenzy. Because of its violent past, Krakatoa's name is known around the world. In one sense, it would be quite appropriate to call the whole of this area, including Ujung Kulon, Krakatoa National Park. As we've seen, the volcano that vanished in the Big Bang of 1883 was responsible for creating, and more important, preserving, not only the islands and their reefs, but Ujung Kulon itself. The question that must now be in everyone's mind is, will Anak Krakatoa, at some future date, repeat the performance? Just across the Sunda Strait, Ujung Kulon luxuriates in its present security from human interference. From the air, it's easy to see how 40-foot seismic waves overran it. Hopefully, it will never happen again. For Ujung Kulon is one of the very last sanctuaries of perhaps the rarest large animal on Earth. Tracks are all that is usually seen of them. The animals have only been filmed once before, and then very briefly in black and white. This is the first time they have been captured at length on colour film. The jungle of Ujung Kulon is so dense that wildlife cameraman Dieter Plage decided his only chance was along the banks of the Chigenta River. Even so, it took 6 months before he succeeded. There were occasional tantalizing glimpses, usually when the great animal was crossing the river before disappearing into the jungle again. Then suddenly one day, Dieter Plage was face to face with a big bull Javan rhino, one of perhaps 70 of these animals left on Earth. In this species, only the bulls have prominent horns. Nearby was a cow. The triangular plate of hide at the neck is one of the things that distinguishes the Javan from other Asian rhinos. The female suddenly moves off towards the male, who has retreated some way into the jungle. The male sprays the vegetation so that the female will follow him. And there's the male again. He's slightly more wary this time. He settles down again, giving an opportunity for a unique close-up. He's joined by the female. Soon she calmly starts to feed. The prehensile upper lip reaches out to seize the vegetation. Ujung Kulon had revealed its greatest mystery far more generously than Dieter Plager could ever have hoped. It had provided this unique record of one of the world's rarest animals. The rhinos never gave another chance like this. They simply vanished into the forest. August the 27th, 1883, was the day that shook the world and destroyed so much life and property. It was also the day that isolated and helped to preserve this remarkable wilderness area. One can only hope Ujung Kulon is never destroyed again. But with the sun of Krakatoa fulminating in the sea, only 25 miles away, no one can ever be quite certain.